Not getting a steady water flow like this? Struggling with fluctuating water pressure or a noisy water pump? Hello, and thank you for stopping by. In this DIY repair tutorial, I'll show you everything I used and what you need to know about well pressure tanks. From old style tanks, diaphragm tanks, to bladder style tanks, I'll break down the components, common tools, and techniques I used for a successful repair. I will show you how to identify signs of a failing well pressure tank. I'll show you how I replaced it, and tips to keep your water pressure steady and reliable. So, whether you are troubleshooting pressure issues, replacing a faulty tank, or just learning how to maintain your home water system, this video is a good start for the DIY enthusiast of all skill levels, from beginners to experienced handymen, and is designed to save you some time and money on costly repairs. To get started, let me show you the three types of tanks I mentioned. This is the old style one compartment pressure tank. This tank didn't have any bladder or diaphragm in it. It simply had compressed air on the top. Water would come into the bottom, fill the tank up. As water was drawn, the compressed air would force it down and go to your faucet. This tank, the original one I had, was lined with glass. It had glass lining on the inside. And all these tanks have a Schrader valve on top where you could add air to get the right pressure. And the compressed air controls a pressure valve. It's not shown in the picture here. The pressure valve has two settings, an on and an off. When it fills up and the water creates more pressure, it'll trigger the valve, it'll shut the power off to the pump, and the pump will stop pumping. When the pressure gets low, the second setting will trip, it'll send electricity to the pump, and the pump will fill it up again. So this is the first tank. This is the old style tank. The tank that I'm replacing has a bladder in it. It works on the same principle, but there's a bag inside this tank. As water comes in, the bag fills with water. The pressure gets to a point where it triggers the pressure switch, shuts off the power to the pump until the pressure gets low enough, and it triggers that pressure switch to send power to the pump to fill it up again. This tank out of the three is the best option. The tank we're putting in today has a diaphragm. Works on the same principle. There's compressed air on top. As the water comes into the tank and fills up that section, the air gets more compressed, triggers the pressure switch. As the water's being drawn down, there's less compressed air in the tank, and that triggers that pressure switch to send power to the pump, and the pump starts that cycle all over again. So this is the three tanks that we have, and they all work on the same principle. The compressed air pushes the water out. If we didn't have these tanks, your pump would short cycle. Every time you would draw water, your pump would come on, and every time you shut the faucet off, the pump would go off. At some point, that would burn the pump out. Keep in mind, I'm not a plumber, just a DIY guy trying to save some time and money. If you have any questions, post them down below and I'll answer them to the best of my knowledge. Now, let's get to the tank. Finally, we're at the tank. This is what the tank looks like after 39 to 40 years being down in this damp room. This tank is located in the corner of my garage that is often very damp. You can see this wall over here has a lot of humidity coming through it. This was all wet down in here. I had a fan in here to dry it up. This is where the water line used to come into. We had a leak in the water line, and I had a plumber come in and put this line in. And if you want, in the comments, I'll tell you the joke that this guy was that installed this. What a nightmare. After installing this line, I had nothing but water leaks in my garage, where for 5 years prior, never had a problem. Anyway, back to this tank. I was shaking this tank to see if it was waterlogged, and you can see that it's tipped. Well, the legs on the bottom were rusted out, and they couldn't support me shaking it back and forth. When these tanks go, they become waterlogged. One of the ways to check to see if this is waterlogged, and if this happens, it's definitely waterlogged. Let me show you. You have this valve on top, just like a valve on a car tire. You unscrew it, and there's a Schrader valve here. This is so you can add air to it if the air pressure should ever drop. And it does happen as time goes on. Press down on this valve, you should get air coming out. In our case, you're getting water. This tank is waterlogged and definitely has to be changed. And as I mentioned upstairs, I couldn't find another tank to replace this particular tank. It's either 39 or 40 years old, this tank. Inside this tank, there's a bladder. So when the water fills up, it's filling the bladder. It's not touching the metal on the inside. I believe that's the only reason this tank lasted as long as it did. The tank that's replacing this has a bladder. As I showed in the picture previously, water will fill in from the bottom. As the water fills up, it's going to put pressure on that bladder. And as that bladder starts swelling up, it's going to get the extra pressure from the air that's in the tank. And that's going to be detected by the pressure switch, which will then shut off the power to the pump. From that point, as you use your water, your shower, your sink, the air pressure in there will push that bladder down, push the water out, and when it gets to a certain pressure, it'll be detected by the pressure switch, which will then send power to the pump it up with water again, and start that cycle all over. Well, let's get started. I have my bucket of tools, and there's always something else I'll need, but fortunately I'm working at home and I'm in my garage. Now, you're going to need something to check the power. When you start this, you want to make sure that the power is off. You should have a multimeter. If you don't have one, they're inexpensive. You should pick one up. You'll find many uses for this as time goes on. Try to keep the water out of it. A test light. And over here, I have this homemade test light. Now, you say, why would I make a homemade test light? The reason for this light is I was working on something a while back, and I wasn't sure of the wiring. I didn't want to blow out the multimeter. And at the time, I had a different test light. I wanted to make sure I didn't burn them out. So I used this. The worst that would happen is I burn the bulb out, and that'd be the end of it. And I've used this quite a few times. Now, today, as it happened, when I was checking the power on the switch, I crossed the wires the wrong way, and you can see the burn mark. It blew out that bulb. If I was using the multimeter, there's a fuse in here, but it would have blew out the fuse. I would have taken it apart, put another fuse in. But this homemade test light was the sacrificial tool. Okay, that said, let's cover this up. I want to show you what this looks like underneath. The original tank was here 7 to 8 years, and this tank was here 39 to 40 years. I'm not quite sure. When I replaced this tank, I just kept everything the way it was. What I wanted to do was cut this pipe and bring this up a little bit, get it off the ground. But it lasted all this time. Maybe it would have lasted a little longer if I didn't have it so close to the ground with all this dampness. You have the water line from the pump coming down. Goes into this backflow. There's different opinions of whether there should be a backflow on the water supply line, but I'm not going to get into that right now. Over here, this is plugged. Back here, we have the pressure gauge, which you can see is totally shot. And again, the way this works, water gets pumped from the well, goes into the tank, switch cuts the power, and the pump stops. When the pressure gets too low, it starts it all over again. Then we have this fitting that goes into this relief valve. I'm not sure what this is. It might be 100 pounds, 100 something pounds of pressure. If the water pressure gets too high, this will pop and not have the tank explode. And then we have a shut-off. These shut-offs, when you have them for so long and you don't use them, they always leak. If you're doing this and you're going to be replacing them, you're better off with the shut-off valves that have the lever, like this. On any installs I put in, I never had one of those leak. So I'm going to try to keep this whole assembly together and just disconnect it down here, if possible. If I could just disconnect it down there, I could leave this and possibly put the new one in with the setup I have right now. The error is on my part. I thought I ordered the new T with the new pressure switch and everything else, but evidently I didn't click on it when I put the order in. So now, let me show you what we look like underneath here. You can see the way it's coming out. There's that elbow, the fitting, then that black pipe. If I could get this off here, we'll be in good shape. If not, I'll have to disconnect it over here and disconnect it over here. There's not a union over here. My original installations, or if I'm redoing something, I like putting unions in, so if you have to take something apart for a few dollars, it makes it a lot easier the next time you're in. This is something I picked up over the years, and I find it to be very useful. Before I do anything else, I'm going to go to the circuit box, shut the circuit breaker off to the switch, because I don't want water spraying all over, as it did back there on top of the equipment on live electric. I'm going to turn the faucets on upstairs, see how much water comes out. More than likely, it's not going to empty the tank because it's waterlogged. Once the water stops flowing upstairs, I'm going to shut this valve off. I'm going to hook up a hose to the spigot here. And then to get the water out over here, I'm going to use a compressor. Oh, let me get up. I'm going to use a compressor and pump air into the tank, and hopefully I can get most of this water out. I have a tight fit where this has to go through, and if I can't get it through, I'm going to have to cut it up, and I'd rather not do that. Years back, I used to leave the garage door partially open for some cats that we had. In the winter time, there were cats we didn't let into the house, but I had a little section where they could sleep in the garage. What would happen, it would get so cold in here, this pipe would freeze. Now that's something else. All the years that this was in the frozen garage, this pipe freezing, I used to have to heat up this pipe because this is where it would freeze, right here. Never had trouble with this tank, not once. If you look at the reviews on a lot of these tanks, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, they're leaking already. Anyway, we built this little room around the tank to keep it somewhat insulated. Now I really don't need this room, but it's here, and I like to leave it the way it is if possible. I just don't know if I'm going to be able to make it through the door with this tank. It's a little wide, but we'll see. Oh, and another thing, to get that hose off, I have pipe wrenches to get that off, but more than likely that's going to be tough pulling it. So I'm going to heat that up with a torch. Nothing special, just a propane torch. Or if you have a heat gun, you might be able to use that also. Now hear that? The water came on. We have and see how quick that shut off? That's a problem, because when you draw water, this tank isn't filling up, and the water and this pump will come on and off, causing damage to the pump. It's not a problem with how long the pump runs. The problem is the on and off. See that? That's what we call the short cycle. That's how I knew there was a problem in here. I was doing something in the garage and I heard this clicking on and off. I came in and I looked at this and I found it wet in here. Found this disaster. I want to point out, if ever you don't have water and your tank is okay, it's not waterlogged, pull this cap off. Be very careful. There was a couple times where I had a pressure switch where the contact points were corroded. They were like burnt. If any of you ever had an old car with points, remember you would have to clean them up a little bit because the car wouldn't start or would run rough. Same thing on here, same idea. Obviously you shut the power down before you do it. And another thing, if it's in the basement or if it's outside, some people have these tanks outside. If you're down south, you'll get spiders in there, you'll get bugs in there. And sometimes the bugs will have enough debris around these contact points, either webs or whatever they might pull into there, where they can't work properly. And all it is blowing it out with some air, and you got water back. So let me go shut the power off, drain this water, and more than likely, I'm not going to have a step-by-step on how I'm pulling this apart. It's real tight in here. You get a good view with the camera, lighting, and everything else. I just don't have the time to try to set that up. I have to get this done. This is at home, and we need the water. So let me get started on this, and I'll show you the progress as we go along. I opened the water valve in the upstairs bathroom until the water stopped coming out. Then I came down here. I shut the valve off with the water going upstairs. None of the water would come out of this tank. The leak over here happened when I was trying to get that hose clamp off. So you can see I did get water out. And this is, Johnny, this is the second one or the third one?
Second.
This is the second one. Now watch what I'm doing to get this water out. And the advantage of getting this water out, this tank is pretty heavy with the water in it. So we want to get out as much water as we can. I have my little pancake compressor. Put some air on top. And you can see the water going in there from the air pressure. John, pick that hose up. Okay. If this tank was working properly, this is how it would work when the pump was off. The pressure in the tank forces the water out. It gets to a lower water pressure. It triggers the control switch. Control switch sends power to the pump. Pump pumps water in, fills up, shuts it off, and the cycle starts over. I got Johnny helping me out today. Now it's pretty dark in here, and we're videoing this as we're doing the work, and I really have to get this going. As I mentioned earlier, this is my home tank, and with this disconnected, there isn't any water supply for the house. I'm getting a later start than I wanted to today, but it is what it is. All right, John, it is what it is. Yep. So I'm going to finish draining this tank. Clamp down there is rusted on. I might have to cut it off. What I'm trying to do is to disconnect that line and leave all this intact, because I'm waiting for the new one to come in, and I don't want to take it apart and have to put it together 3 times. 3 times? Let's see. 1, 2, and then 3. Yeah. So I don't want to have to take it apart and put it together 3 times. This eliminates 1 time putting it together. I'm going to try to get that black hose over here. It's a plastic hose like this. I'm going to try to use that on the new tank.
Okay.
Okay. Let me empty this tank, and once I have it out, I'll show you what it looks like underneath. I have it installed. I left the fan on in here for a couple hours to dry this floor up so I could see if there were any leaks coming from the tank or from the setup. Now, this setup is going to have to be changed. As I mentioned before, I like to bring it up a couple inches off the ground, raise this tank, cut this pipe over here, right here, and bring this up. But for now, it's working. If you remember, I mentioned before that these valves leak when you don't use them for a long time. This valve here isn't leaking, but this valve up here, this one's leaking. And the way this is set up, this is the water line that feeds the house. I have a shut off here. I had this valve shut off, and the water would come down this way into the water softener, then out of the water softener and back up. I have a shut off valve here and a shut off valve here in the event I would ever have to move the water softener, which I did have to move to get the old tank out. Now to check what pressure the switch is going to send power to the pump to turn it on, and what pressure it's going to cut off to shut the pump down. Let me get this camera in view. To draw some water down, I have Johnny watering the chickens, and I have the washing machine running right now. So let's see when this clicks on and off. It might have clicked before I got back here. I hear it running. Let's see when she turns off. Is it going to hit pressure with everything running? Oh, I seen a drip over here. Now I don't know if this is sweat or a drip. You're getting a lot of sweating over here. A lot of the humidity today. This pipe on the side, I thought it was leaking, but it was just sweating. I thought it was going off, then it slowed down and then started up again. Not to keep you waiting until this clicks on again, I'm going to speed this video up. Okay, it's holding at that 40 or 30 something, I can't see it. Another reason to raise this tank, besides keeping it off the ground to avoid some rust, is that you can't read anything like this. This is too much for me. I had to walk away. I shut that washer off. I have to upload this video to see what pressure this was moving back and forth on. I wasn't down here all this time. Meanwhile, I'm going to take this camera outside and show you what that old tank looks like. All right, and here we have it. Here's the old tank out in the yard. This was from Sears, called Captive Air. I have the patent number. I just couldn't get this model number. I would have really liked to replace this tank. Call it 40 years that it's been around. A little rust up here. Look how well this tank was put together. Now on the bottom, you can see the way these legs rusted out. I did a little demolition when I was trying to drag it out of there, but these are always in a damp situation. I can't find the owner's manual on this, but I remember reading, if that bladder ever went on this tank, you would unbolt these bolts on the bottom, pull it out, pull the bladder out, and just put a new bladder in. And that would be in. This tank wasn't made to replace the tank. It was made to replace the bladder. That's why I probably can't find one like this. If this lasted me in the conditions that it was used, and in the 40 years that this tank was used, I had family members that lived with me. There was a lot of water that was pumped through this tank. But this is it. If you could find a tank like this, even if you have to go for $500 to $800 more, I would get this tank. And if you do find a tank like this anywhere, let me know. Get back to me, because I will definitely change out what I just put in. And another thing, I didn't video the installation of the tank. I want to point out this little cap. If you're putting your tank in, the new tank will come in with a cap like this to protect the thread. And the one that I just installed, this didn't look like a plug. It looked like an O-ring. So I knew there was a plug in there. But just to let you know, if you're installing a new tank, look for this plug before you get it into position. And that's about it. If you have any questions or comments, let me know. Post them down below. If you enjoyed the video, give it a like. It does help. And if you haven't done so already, subscribe. Hit that Joe Z button. And not to miss my new videos as I upload them, be sure to ring that bell. Until next time, stay safe.